So this is Jamie Peck, who's a professor of geography at the University of British Columbia, and we're going to talk about his paper Variegated Capitalism, which was published in Progress in Human Geography in 2007. So Jamie, do you want to tell us a little bit about what the paper is about in its kind of broad context?
It came out of a European Union research program called Demologos, and the program was trying to apply heterodox economic theories to urban and regional questions, and a series of us were working on different areas of social theory, and the project that Theodore and I worked on was on the Varieties of Capitalism literature, and we wanted to develop a critique of that work and a geographical take on what an alternative to it might be, because in some respects the Varieties of Capitalism debate, which has been largely driven by political science and sociology, is dealing with fundamentally geographical questions, but there have been no geographers involved in the conversation. And the geographies that they're dealing with are the highly simplistic geographies of national variation. There's no intra-national variation. There's very little connection between national capitalisms. It's quite taxonomic. So it seemed to us that there was a geographical response to that literature waiting to be written, and that was really the impetus for the paper.
Okay, so what's your principal argument that you're trying to make, or the theoretical tool you're trying to give people to take away?
We're in some respects, I think the argument is that if you think relationally about differences in capitalism, you've got to theorize connection as well as divergence. So the varieties of capitalism literature is very good on taxonomic differences between, let's say, American capitalism or German capitalism, and they'll essentially catalogue the institutional features of those national systems and attribute differences in economic dynamics to the institutional differences. And our argument is that that fails to deal with connections between these capitalisms. And I think one that we develop in the paper, for instance, is the connection between Chinese capitalism and American capitalism, which are codependent. One couldn't exist without the other. And so simply to catalogue the features of each system and try to explain it in those terms is not adequate. So we were really using the tools of relational economic geography to think about these connections as well as differences. And that's why we use the word variegated rather than variety. Variety seems to us to be a taxonomic way of dealing with difference. Variegation refers to a phenomena which is differentiated, but it is a phenomena. So we were dealing with a capitalism which is polymorphic.
Right.
So its various forms are interconnected. So that's what we try to do using arguments that are well developed in economic geography since the 80s. But in some respects, there's something of an auto-critique of economic geography in the paper as well, because I would say that since the 1980s, economic geographers have largely been working on regional scale questions using meso-analytic categories, industrial districts, those sorts of issues. So in some respects, economic geographers had abandoned the national scale and they abandoned what we call the big geographies of capitalism. And so this was also, we're also speaking to economic geographers and saying, look, we should be part of this conversation. And we've kind of abandoned that territory of large-scale economic transformation. How do we get back into that conversation?
Do you want to just say something briefly to explain to people what you mean by different kinds of capitalisms? So what's the kind of difference between American capitalism and Chinese capitalism? And
right.
So I suspect a lot of people just think capitalism, but they don't necessarily think it with an S on the end, if you know what I mean.
Sure, yeah. Well, the Varieties literature emerged in the early 1990s in response to orthodox globalization stories that we were essentially moving towards a singular capitalism after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And the Varieties literature came out of France and continental Europe, and it was making the argument that post-1989, it wasn't victory of a singular capitalism, but there are many forms of capitalism. And they're especially drawing a distinction between the European styles of capitalism, which are heavily mediated by state action. Welfare state is co-present with the development of those styles of capitalism. And they are more organized forms. They often involve negotiation between unions and management, often at the national level, in tripartite arrangements. And so those are more coordinated forms of capitalism. And that's typically contrasted with the American style of capitalism, which is more deregulated, relies on a smaller state, less interventionist. But one of the problems with that literature is that there's a sort of assumption that American capitalism is near to textbook economics capitalism.
Right.
It's near to the neoclassical model of what an economy ought to look like. And the European model is different for some unexplained reason. And so we were rather dissatisfied with that simple formulation as well, because we fully recognize the differences between these styles of development. So let's say in a lot of German capital markets there's a much more of a long-term approach to investment and so on, whereas American capital markets move on a quarterly basis or even shorter term. So there's a kind of short-termism in the American system, patient capital in Europe. So there are some really important differences. But at the same time, to suggest that American capitalism is closer to some pure theoretical form seemed to us to be making a fundamental mistake about the character of that style of economic development, which we would argue is constituted through the state in a different way. You just look at the role of military spending in the United States or large-scale incarceration. So you've got a very powerful state in some respects in the USA. The state's doing different things. It's interdigitated with capitalism in different ways. So it seemed to us that the literature had thrown up the Varieties Literature had thrown up some important issues for observations of differences in the development of capitalism, long-run trajectories. But they weren't really getting into the question of how are these interrelated. So one illustration of the way they're interrelated, we would argue, is that neoliberalization operates across all varieties. And it doesn't mean that a pure neoliberal capitalism will be victorious, but it's important to trace these dynamics in a differentiated sort of landscape.
Right.
So that was the reason we pursued those sort of questions.
Right, okay. And how might somebody take your ideas and apply them in an empirical context? Like, how, if I was to kind of read your paper and I was trying to take your ideas and I wanted to go off and roll them out or apply them into the field, what would I be doing? What would I be looking at?
Okay. Well, I think we've had a very positive response to the paper. I think there's a sense that a lot of people who are working on these questions of broad-scale transformations in capitalism, this perhaps provides a way for them to start to think about more large-scale categories like national systems, the ways in which these are scaled and so on, rather than simply working at the regional scale, which has been in some respects economic geography's stock in trade for 20 years now. There's a fantastic body of work on regional. So we know more about Silicon Valley than we do about American capitalism. So we know more about Third Italy than we do about Italian capitalism. So I think it creates an impetus to ask questions across scales and try to connect what economic geography has learned about regional formations of capitalism to what it might learn about national and transnational formations. I mean,
so you're making a case really for a multi-scalar analysis of how capitalism works.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
And does that tie into arguments around looking at multi-level of governance that would go with that?
It does. And I mean, unfortunately, it produces a vast research agenda. And one of the reasons that that economic geographers have achieved so much on regional level work is that that's quite compatible with small research teams or individual researchers, and so to work across scales in complex systems can often require resources that maybe people don't have access to. So it does create a sort of challenge, and maybe something for economic geographers to aim at collectively is how we respond to these kinds of questions, because I think there's a sense in the sociology and political science literature and so on that geographers have something to say about this, but we still haven't really made our voice heard. And so we might need to develop different ways of working if we're to work across scales. Could call for different forms of collaboration, say, teams working together on these questions.
Do you get a sense that the paper is being picked up and read by people in economics and politics and IR or other disciplines?
It's certainly been used and talked about in economic sociology and political science and this field of socioeconomics, which is a heterodox or non-neoclassical forms of economics, and I've also been making the argument for a number of years that economic geographers ought to be building stronger relationships with that heterodox economics community, because it seems to me that they're people that view economy in similar ways to we do, to the way that we do. Neoclassical economics holds on to a monological view of how economy works. Market forces are supposed to operate in more or less the same way over time and over space. Mm-hmm. So the neoclassical world is a flat earth, and I think it's completely antithetical to a geographical view. On the other hand, I think that heterodox economists who work in sociology, political science, international political economy and so on, I think they're all potentially open to geographical arguments, but have barely started to think about it. I think it's up to us to put them on the table. They work with national categories while never theorising the spatial dimension, and that's just the given scale for them. And I don't think they're I think they would be receptive to the arguments we might make, but I don't think we've actually pushed them as firmly as we might in those interdisciplinary conversations.
Right, okay. And do you think I'm just wondering around the kind of the financial crash that kind of happened the year after your paper came out, and the kind of the implications.
Nothing to do with me, though.
Nothing to do with you, but like the implications of the paper, maybe for thinking through what happens with that, which obviously demonstrated this kind of interconnectedness of these various capitalisms.
Right. And I think that's, in some respects, I think the work in economic geography that is most appreciated in the heterodox economic sphere is the work of financial geographers. That's read a lot, used a lot, and I think the accounts of people like Andrew Lation and so on they've found a very wide audience in the context of the post-crash environment, because I think what that's clearly created is it's reorganized the global economy in this. It underlines the fact it is this interconnected system. And Chinese capitalism and American capitalism remain utterly codependent. In a sense, the fortunes of the global economy are partly oscillating around that relationship, which is deeply contradictory and problematic. But both economies need the other. And so I think the post-financial crisis period has been one in which we've seen a reordering of the global system, but it's merely underlined this point about the interconnectedness of the system. And I think highlights also the limitations of theorizing locally and not thinking about connection. So in a sense that's always been part of economic geography's stock in trade, to position regions in wider economies, but I think we've got to kind of work over even more ambitious scales now.
And just finally then, the paper was published in 2007, so probably written before then. How have you kind of taken the ideas yourself and moved them forward over the last kind of 4 years? Like, what kinds of things have you working on that might have come out of that that literature you were working on then?
Well, it was one of the things that when we'd finished writing that paper, Nick, Theodore and I, we realised that it was committing us to doing something rather than just leaving it as publishing the paper and then moving on. And so in trying to realise some of the objectives of the paper, I've been working over the past few months on questions of Chinese capitalism, how Chinese capitalism is organised, because Chinese capitalism has been an outlier to that varieties literature, largely focused on a transatlantic view of capitalism, in a sense using Eurocentric theoretical categories. And the rise of China has occurred outside of the field of vision of the traditional varieties of capitalism debate. But suddenly, I mean, almost nobody would deny today that the Chinese economy is phenomenally important for the world system, and it's embedded in the global capitalist system in complex ways. Yet at the same time, the Chinese economy is still managed by the Chinese Communist Party, and it's at least nominally one where the word capitalism is rarely used in association with the kind of economy that's grown there. So there's a huge question about how Chinese capitalism might be characterized, and especially its relational connections with the wider economy. So this has been largely theoretical work so far on Chinese capitalism I've been doing. But that's one of the ways in which I've tried to keep this project moving along. And I think in a series of other ways as well, economic geographers that are interested in more political economic questions and macro questions have found some of that literature useful in pushing forward a different set of arguments at a somewhat more abstract and macro scale than before. So I think still a lot of work to do, but at least some positive movements in that direction.